Women's World Cup kicks off in New Zealand and Australia. We'll discuss the teams, the players, and the controversies. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The host countries of the Women's World Cup didn't waste their home advantage in crowded stadiums. New Zealand stunned Norway, while Australia defeated Ireland. CGTN's Greg Navarro has the latest from Sydney.
A very big night for co-host New Zealand, which had not won a World Cup game in 15 attempts. That changed on the 16th attempt tonight, the opening game of the 2023 Women's World Cup, defeating Norway by a score of 1-0. The celebrations afterwards as if New Zealand won the World Cup instead of simply the opening game. Now, here in Sydney and across Australia, there have been 40 viewing sites set up in addition to all of the stadiums because ticket sales, the ticket demand is so high. So far, they've sold more than 1.4 million tickets, making this the most attended Women's World Cup ever. There's also more teams in this one than ever before, 32. In fact, experts say the expansion of teams has helped China on its path to qualify for this Women's World Cup. It plays in Group D and faces a very difficult group led by European champion England, as well as Haiti and powerhouse Denmark. In fact, Denmark will be China's first opponent here in Australia in Adelaide on Saturday. Those two teams, a very important game for both of them. Their rankings very close at the moment, according to the FIFA rankings. Remember, the top two teams from each group stage then go on to the knockout rounds. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
We've got a lot to talk about. Let's get right to our panelist. Kacey White is a former player for the U.S. national team and a football analyst. She joins us from Tampa, Florida. Here in Washington, D.C., Lisa Delpy Neirotti is the director of the sport management program at the George Washington University. From Rio de Janeiro, we have journalist Tim Vickery, and Paul Dong is CGTN's sports and culture commentator. He is joining us from Beijing. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Kacey, I'm going to begin with you. We have these two matches in the books. New Zealand taking on Norway. Australia against Ireland. I want to get your thoughts on the first two contests.
Well, it's a really close competition, which I think is what everyone expects at this point. Just the parity in the game is so huge, but for both host nations to get the wins, that is so big for both of those countries as they go throughout the tournament.
And you played for the U.S. team. They've dominated when it comes to the World Cup. In fact, they're going for a three-peat, which would be remarkable. There's a lot of new players, though. Do they have a new identity? How would you describe the team?
Well, the same identity permeates all the years of the U.S. women's national team. We want to be competitive. We want to get after it. But with 14 new faces in the World Cup, there's a lot of youth and a lot of players that are really passionate and excited to get on the field.
It'll be fun to watch. Lisa, this is the first time, as Greg mentioned, 32 teams. Popularity is growing. He was saying ticket demand's very high. What are your thoughts? Is it becoming more mainstream?
Definitely, the women's sports is on the rise all over the world. And, you know, what needs to happen is everybody needs to tune in and so the TV rights can be justified. So right now we're having some issues with getting it equal pay for the broadcast rights.
Well, Lisa, to that point, I was talking to a colleague yesterday who was willing to get up at 3 a.m. to watch it. I mean, the time difference is an obstacle in a sense here in the U.S., right?
Yes, but you can record it, you can make parties around it, so get out there and support it.
All right, good point. Tim, Brazil, of course, a powerhouse when it comes to football. It's been a lot of talk about Marta. You know, she's been named World Player of the Year 6 times. This is her 6th World Cup, but she's been denied all those times. Obviously, a lot of interest in her story, her storyline. Can she get it over the finish line? She's getting a little bit older. She's 37. Give us your sense about this story, because I think it's one that's going to be watched quite closely.
Yeah, well, these days, Marta is the wise old head in the Brazil side. She probably won't start most of the games. But the significance of Marta is undeniable. What Marta has done in Brazil and in large parts of the world, she has legitimized women's football as a sport. Now, I don't know how much this applies to the United States. Maybe Kacey can illuminate us. But in so much of the rest of the world, women's football is an act of resistance. Almost, it's a political act to deny a pre-ascribed role that traditional societies want to put you into. Women's football in Brazil was officially banned from the early 40s to the late 70s. Once it was up and running, the Brazilian authorities were very, very slow to get behind it. It was people like Marta, a couple of other great players as well, really by their own sense of sacrifice, have hauled the sport up to a level where it has been legitimised, and it is growing to an extent that older people can scarcely believe it. So the importance of Marta transcends totally what she's done on the field. She is a political actor of enormous importance. Now, Brazil were, when Marta was at her best, one of the top sides in the world. They've fallen back really because of lack of investment. They're trying to make up for lost time. They brought in a Swedish coach with a huge track record. She's trying to make them, as well as South Americans, a little bit more Northern European. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. But Brazil are going there for the first time in 2 or 3 World Cups. They're going there very, very optimistic that they can go deep into this competition.
Kacey, I saw you nodding your head, so I want to give you a chance to respond, and then I have another follow-up question for Tim. But first, you.
Well, Tim's 100% right that it just transcends just being on the soccer field, and Marta's been just such an influential person in that for Brazil and for the sport in general. But I agree with them. Pia Sundhage has taken over that team from Sweden originally. She has a great knack for respecting the culture of the country that she coaches, which she did with the U.S. and now with Brazil, but she also has some defensive tactics that I think will help Brazil go really far in this World Cup.
And Tim, I wanted to ask you this follow-up because we know when it comes to football in Brazil, it's almost like a religion. And when there's a World Cup game and it involves the men, people don't go to work. There's parties in the streets. Is it being embraced the same way when it comes to the women's teams?
We're getting there, you know. Can I just tell you a quick story from the 1996 Olympics? When Brazil went to compete, it was the first time there was a women's tournament. The women's team went cattle class. They had to walk past the men's team in first class. And they were only given enough pennants, you know, the pennants that the captains exchange at the start of the games. They were only given enough pennants for the group matches. They qualified from the group, but they didn't have a pennant to give to the opposing captain. So the goalkeeper was the only one who spoke a little bit of English. He had to teach the captain enough English to apologise for the lack of pennants. Now, the country sits down to watch and debate the moment when the squad is called up. Civil servants are going to be allowed to have time off to watch the games. The sport has made dramatic strides, and if Kacey is correct and Brazil do go deep into this competition, this thing will really take off.
All right, so the next time you say, can I tell you a story after that story, yeah, the answer is obviously yes. That was a great story. Paul, let's talk about another team that we should keep our eye on, and that's China. It's in a tough group, as Greg pointed out. It's got its first match coming up against Denmark, but it comes in as the current Asia champion. Kind of handicap things for us.
Well, it's quite difficult to predict now, and it's even controversial to call that group tough. Because once you have New Zealand upsetting Norway, and that group turns out to be more difficult than previously thought. And only after the first match between China and Denmark can we tell how difficult that group actually is or means to China. But as a witness for Chinese soccer's women's soccer development over the past few decades, yeah, today really brings me back to many, many years ago when China joined the many other world countries to be among the earliest participants in World Cup history, although China was not among the first to develop women's soccer. And China benefited from a very unique centralized system that can help a group of young girls or other male athletes to pick up something really new to them, but can make progress within a short time. And then, many other organizations have major tournaments around the world during those early stage years of China's opening up back in the 1980s. Almost everybody was trying to land something major on China, in the Chinese mainland. no matter how difficult it would mean to train the local staff. And then 1991, it was several southern Chinese cities in Guangdong province that hosted the very inaugural Women's World Cup. And then 2007, once again, 1 year before the 2008 Summer Olympics came to Beijing, several Chinese cities, Shanghai, Wuhan, co-hosted, well, as a nation, hosted the Women's World Cup again. And those years, we also witnessed China's dominance in Asia. And China didn't care too much about, a major rival maybe from Denmark or from Japan. But now China is no longer in that position, despite the most recent reclaiming of the Asian Cup title, the first time in 15 years. But now we are hearing very different voices from messages from the team. The vice president of the Chinese Football Association, which was one of the most successful women's soccer players of all time, Sun Wen, voices the kind of relaxation and also understanding about the situation, trying to relax the pressure on the team. But at the same time, the head coach of the team, whom Sun Wen mentored, is very, very pessimistic in her recent remarks in an interview, complaining about how difficult that group is, especially about Denmark. So I think Chinese fans have a kind of very mixed preparations for what will happen on Saturday.
Yeah, you can never tell what's going to happen, but Lisa, we heard Tim's story about how basically the women's team was second-class citizens, and just the story about the pennants. It was back in 1978 when Marilyn Loden coined the phrase "breaking the glass ceiling." Of course, it's still with us. Women have chipped away in a number of fields, but women's soccer still an obstacle in a sense. There was a recent UK poll, and 60% of the respondents said they're just not interested. How discouraging is that, and what needs to happen to turn that around?
Well, we can always look at the glass half full or half empty, right? So we could say maybe, 4 years ago, 40%, or I mean, I should say higher percent said they weren't interested. So I think over time, and as the team's competition improves, for years, the Women's World Cup has been an afterthought for FIFA, for the national federations, and it's just now that people are gravitating to it, and national federations are having more competitions nationally, and there's, like the women's professional soccer leagues are growing in different countries, and that's all going to build a fan base. So we have to be patient, and we can't think of women's sports as an add-on. We need to think of it as a proper sports property like it is, and build a business case for it. And that's going to take some time.
Yeah, and Kacey, I want to get your thoughts, obviously, on this, since you spent some time on the pitch. But as she says, it's an afterthought. And I think as a result of it being an afterthought, it's kind of fed this narrative. And before I get your response, I want to show this video that's really become kind of a viral sensation. And it looks at the age-old complaint that just the women, their play is just not as good as the men. Let's watch this video, and I want to get your response on the other end.
Oui, bien sûr que c'est passé. Maintenant, faut que ça aille au bout. Allez. Ouais, c'est bien joué. Il y a un but qui a poussé. Il y a un but qui a poussé. Voilà. C'est pénalty, ça. C'est fait. Les Bleus qui reviennent dans le match. Et on a encore le droit de rêver. Avec le pivot. Quel toucher de balle extraordinaire. Là, il y a un bon ballon de foot à jouer. Bien fait, bien fait. Pour le centre en plaque. Bah oui, bravo. Le centre en frais. Oh, le geste d'ailleurs. La tête piquée. Oh, quelle effet. Superbe. Elle est belle cette équipe. Ouais, c'est ça. Le football qu'on aime.
So we used to have a phrase in our business, the magic of television. Now the magic of digital manipulation. Of course, as you know, that the players are all women, but they're digitally enhanced to be men at the beginning, and they change it over, and just showing these beautiful plays. Is this going to silence the critics, where maybe they'll open their eyes and see the game differently?
I don't know. I think it's a positive step, though, because seeing it side by side, well, first of all, what a brilliant concept for the advertisement. But exposure, just like we've been talking about, is so important. Not just exposure in primetime slots or in different news outlets, but exposure to the level of play of these women. It's grown so much over the last 20 years, and even in the last 5. So the more that we can expose just the general audience to this, the better.
And you know, Lisa, Malcolm Gladwell came out with his book Blink a few years back, and he talked about, you know, this male bias and how it impacts things, and he used orchestras as an example, that a lot of men were getting these seats, and then suddenly they started auditioning the candidates behind a screen where you couldn't see if it was a male or a woman, and suddenly these orchestras are filled with women performers. Obviously, you can't do that with soccer, but in Zurich, the University of Zurich did a study. They graded soccer performances, and when the gender was obscured, women scored just as well as men, but then when it was reversed, suddenly the men looked better. I mean, how do we change this dynamic?
Yes, we have to just keep having people experience the positive performances of women, and that means on newscasts, not just during the regular broadcast of the whole game. We need more highlights. We need more recognition of the women on the field and what they're doing. We do a lot of off the field, but we need to do a lot of what they're doing on the field and focus on their playing performance.
And Paul, the FIFA president, is even weighing in on this. Let's listen to what he has to say, and I want to get your response on the other side.
Many people who still believe that women's football is not, you know, a great game, or it's not so entertaining, or it's a kind of a bad copy of men's football or some stuff like that. Well, when they watch a game for the first time, they will actually see that it's a fantastic game. It's very entertaining. It's great athletes playing. The level has grown incredibly in the last 10 years.
Paul, I want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think the situation in China could be just the opposite to many other places in the world, because the Chinese people, especially among Chinese football and also sports fans, they have been so used to seeing overwhelming, much better performances by their female athletes in this country than the male ones. And there is no other team more disappointing than the Chinese men's soccer team over the past few decades. I think Chinese fans and Chinese audience, and even the general public, has been so used to, you know, reading about good news and positive things about the women, their women's representatives on the world stage than the men's. So there has been for quite some time much louder voices comparing their global or international performances and arguing to pay much higher, you know, salaries or wages to women's athletes than the men's. Although in reality, in some corners, even in soccer's domestic professional leagues, the men's players were for some time paid much higher. But I think the situation is changing very fast. And I think, you know, because without the establishment of very, very commercialized and marketized sports competing against one another in this market, I think situations are changing in China very quickly. And just last year, maybe Chinese men's domestic leagues was still worth more than $1 billion, and this year it could shrink to 1 million only. But women's soccer team can grow in terms of popularity because, you know, social media on the mobile internet cyberspace has been playing such a big role attracting commercial sponsorships and support for individuals and for teams. And I can tell that girls and I mean female users of the internet in China are much more active supporting their icons here. So I can assume that the FIFA wouldn't be disappointed to see something developing even faster here.
And Tim, you know, what we're hearing in China there is remarkable, because that's not the story you'll hear in other parts of the world. In fact, the Australian players made a recent video about the pay disparity. Let's watch a little of that.
Collective bargaining has allowed us to ensure we now get the same conditions as the Socceroos, with one exception. FIFA will still only offer women 1/4 as much prize money as men for the same achievement.
So let's talk about that, because the prize money here is very different from what the men are expecting.
Yes, and this is a battle which is going to have to be fought and fought and fought again. It's really striking how many of the teams in this World Cup are either currently in dispute with their local football federation or recently have been in dispute with their football federation. Here, I think women's football, it has the advantage of being able to look at the men's game and learn what to do, but also learn what not to do. And I'm going to use that in two ways. The first is, I think it's unfortunate in the men's game how much is concentrated in Western Europe, Western European clubs. I worry that we're going down the same road with the women's game. Countries such as England, Holland, France, who weren't powerhouses at the start of the Women's World Cup, they're becoming so on the back of strong leagues. Are there enough places for Africa in the tournament? A number of African debutantes in this tournament, because Africa has so many countries and so few places, it's difficult for countries to qualify for 2 consecutive World Cups and build up the kind of experience that you need to compete. The other is in terms of finances. Now, I'm all in favour of those who put on the show being rewarded for so doing. And for many, many years, men's football didn't reward properly its star players. Now it certainly does. And that there is a rule in elite football finance, which is the more money coming in, the more money gets paid to the elite players. Now, there's a limit to the amount of Ferraris that one can drive. And I think it would be a mistake for women's football to go down the same route, where what we concentrate on is how much the elite players are earning. Money coming into the women's game, we have to ensure that that goes down to the base as well as to the elite players, in order to broaden the base and make it easier for young girls to have a point of entry to play the sport and then later make a living from the sport. So in this sense, I think the men's game stands as an example of the route that the women's game should not follow.
And Kacey, I don't know how many Ferraris you have, but I suspect it's not as many as some of these other gentlemen. But I do want to ask you about this is the first World Cup. The FIFA sold the broadcast rights separately. And of course, Lisa alluded to this. The Wall Street Journal's written an article about this. It was a tough sell. They really had a struggle. And I guess the argument some would maintain is like, look, you know, with the men's, you get all these eyeballs. We're not so sure we're going to get as many eyeballs with the women. And I guess the translation is the women won't be driving as many Ferraris as the gentlemen. But Tim's talking about some lessons learned. What are your thoughts on all of this?
You know, it's disappointing when you still see those disparities happening. But I think Tim makes a really good point about not just in prize money or in broadcast rights, but just an investment in the world game is something that's really important. You have teams from Africa, in Zambia, Nigeria, South Africa, who have qualified. Zambia just beat Germany, who's ranked 4th in the world, in a game leading up to the World Cup. So imagine just the investment that we can have into a lot of different nations and federations around the world, what they can do on the world stage, how that will grow the game globally, not just in the same markets that it's always been successful.
Well, what grows it is, of course, great stories and great games. And so we're going to keep our eye open for all of that. We've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to go kind of do a roundtable, because we know that It's stories of inspiration that resonate. It's stories of desperation and disappointment. It's also stories like we talked about Marta and what she's done for the game, but also like rising stars. So, Kacey, why don't I start with you? As you watch, I mean, is there one game you're going to be watching? Is there one storyline that you're really fascinated with? Is there somebody we should keep our eye on? And I'm going to start with you, and I want to go around and get everybody else's thoughts, but you'll begin.
I think it's almost impossible to give you one name or one storyline that's really exciting. You know, obviously I know the United States team, Naomi Girma is a huge player that I think is going to step out for the U.S. women that people should be watching and really paying attention to as a leader for many years to come. Wang from China is also another player. She plays in the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League. She's a top scorer for China. She's going to be essential, like we already spoke about, for China to do well in their group. But there's a lot of different players and teams because there's a lot of young generations coming through that are going to be really exciting to watch.
And Paul, your predictions?
Well, I mean, the first match between China and Denmark can be so crucial for China's prospect of making out of this stage. But again, like Kacey mentioned, Wang Shuang can be a very, very key player. But when it comes to a personal storyline, I'm still very, very intrigued about what happened to her during her French experience when playing for the PSG on the French league. And she performed quite well, but didn't get along well with her teammates. And that will be a challenging story for all future prospective younger Chinese players if they decide to play overseas.
Ah, fascinating. Lisa, how about you?
Well, I think you can't count out the host countries. So, you know, there's a lot of backing behind them, and for the good of the game, it's also good to see the host countries perform well. I just want to take one quick moment to say something that I feel concerned about is now that the athletes are individually getting some compensation for performing 30,000, I've seen national federations have a backlash. And I think we need to be really careful that national federations have to back the women just as much as the men. So it's almost an internal fight I'm seeing, and it worries me. So just want everybody to know, back your national team, the women, just as much as you do the men.
Good point. And Tim, you've had some great stories for us. What is the story that you'll be talking about after this is over, do you think?
Well, first of all, I've been around long enough to know that only make your predictions after the event. They usually end up more accurate that way. But the storyline I'm looking for is an 18-year-old Colombian, Linda Caicedo, black Colombian girl from a poor background. Now, Colombia is a socially conservative country. I think that the kind of cultural proximity with the United States has helped raise the game in Colombia. But and Colombia, I see as the big hopes of South American women's football, outside Brazil, of course. And Linda Caicedo just joined Real Madrid. If she can have a good tournament and Colombia can go deep into the competition, I think the knock-on effect, the inspirational effect of that will be enormous.
It's always fun to watch. Can't wait, just like the four of you. And thank you so much for your insights. It's been a delight talking to all of you. And that's going to do it for us. That's all the time we have. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.